Morning everybody, happy Wednesday. Now I know I am over the moon excited in almost every episode, pretty much every video, but today I'm really excited because I finally jumped in to reading the very first chapter of my very first Mandarin Chinese graded reader. So in this episode, we'll be talking about what that experience was like and going over some of the strategies that I'm using on this very exciting first part of my journey to reading books fluently in Mandarin Chinese. And that first part is using graded readers. So let's jump in. Okay, so in the last episode, I talked at length about my love for reading, and if you want to be inspired and excited to go off and read something in a language you're learning, then I recommend watching that last video. But essentially, we talked about how I'm going to be using graded readers in Mandarin Chinese. So again, if you're not familiar with what graded readers are, I recommend watching that video, or also my video where I outlined 5 strategies for reading books in foreign languages. But so I showed off this series I have of graded readers. I have a whole bunch of them. And these things have been sitting on my bookshelf for at least 8 months now, I think maybe 10 months. And I do recommend that. I always say that it's great to start building a stockpile of different levels of resources. It's a really great way to keep yourself motivated. I have books in so many languages that I've barely even learned, but it keeps me motivated. I love occasionally flipping through my bookshelf, and I still have all these books, even in Japanese and French, that I haven't read, and I just think that it's great to have these things around to keep yourself motivated. But especially in this case where I knew that eventually I would progress to the level in Mandarin Chinese where I'd want to be reading these books. And so I have a whole bunch of stories, as we talked about in the last video, and I decided to start with Emma. So this is an adaptation of the famous story Emma by Jane Austen. And so this has been adapted to be and more. And I have to say, I'm really impressed so far with the job that Mandarin Companion has done. So I will leave a link to this series of graded readers in the description of the video. That will be my Amazon affiliate link, just in case you want to support my channel while checking out these resources. But as I always say, if you have a local bookshop, then I would prefer you support them first. But yeah, so last night I was in bed, cup of herbal tea. I ended up falling asleep before I actually got to the first page of chapter 1, but I did read through like all the information at the start of the book about, the philosophy that they have at Mandarin Companion. But the thing that impressed me the most was that, they talk about the process they went through to create this adaptation. And even the name, and more, they felt like not only is it quite similar to Emma, the original name of the main character, but they felt like it also preserved this sort of classy feeling that the character has and that I guess the name Emma may have portrayed at the time. But they also talk about how they went to great lengths to find these really ideal cultural parallels between not just, the original context and modern Chinese society, but also the different time periods. And so, whereas when Jane Austen was writing this in a more historical context where perhaps characters are writing letters to each other, in this story they're sending text messages, right? Because I think the goal here was to make this as relevant as possible. So you could definitely argue that you lose some of the historical richness that way, but I can see that philosophy making sense, right? So the idea here is, let's write something that is relevant to the reader, both in terms of the time the story is taking place, but also the society and the cultural context where it's taking place. And so they really seem to have done a good job of mapping these parallels between the original story's context and modern Chinese society, so that reading this story hopefully becomes also a sort of culturally immersive experience where you're also learning certain things, in this case about modern Shanghai. So I wanted to share that because it really impressed me, and I think that is a standard that all graded readers should strive to achieve. But so upon opening the first page of this book this morning, I was still feeling quite nervous because, again, it's like I've never read even probably a single paragraph, let alone a whole passage, let alone a whole book, even if it's a short book in Mandarin Chinese. And I actually would challenge all of you watching this video to think about the languages that you're learning. Now, I know that a lot of you have done this, but I do think a lot of people, if you actually stop and think, sometimes even as we get to the upper intermediate, and I know people who have gone into the advanced levels and just never actually read anything substantial, right? Even an article or certainly something like this. And so it's interesting to sit there and think, I've never done this. You know, I've seen lots of Chinese words, lots of characters, grammatical structures. I've been seeing them in the context, not just words, but phrases. But it's so different than actually just jumping off a cliff, you know, and gliding and just doing it, you know? And I think that this is the same for speaking, right? At a certain point, you do have to just speak, right? Now, it doesn't matter when, it could be much later. I personally do tons of input, and I'm very much an input-based language learner. But again, at a certain point, that first time you speak, it's gonna feel so foreign, and you're gonna be stumbling. And there is this skill, which I feel is almost separate to your vocabulary and your different, you know, your true language level. There is a skill of just being comfortable expressing yourself with whatever language you have in your head at that moment. So somebody who has a lower level of, let's say, Spanish, but they've been speaking a lot, they're gonna probably have a higher level of skill at just expressing themselves with whatever they have than somebody like myself who has perhaps done a lot of input, has a lot larger vocabulary, but has never really spoken. I'm gonna struggle more. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I actually prefer the latter. I prefer to really build up my comprehension ability, my vocabulary, my knowledge of all these different things before I speak. But I'm just saying that there is this skill that I think you just have to develop independently whenever you choose to start speaking and reading. And I think that is a lot of what this first phase of using graded readers is about. It's just getting over it, just doing it. And today's experience was really true to that. So I actually found that within the first sentence, I saw certain words where I was like, I know that character, you know, I know I've seen this before, but this is a bit different, or like, And it was really funny because reading the first sentence and then the first paragraph, again, it was really bizarre because I was struggling a little bit. But then the funny thing is, after reading the first paragraph a couple times through, and then I started to just like remember, like, oh right, that's that word and that's that word, and I see. And again, it was almost like I just needed to, it was very much like having, being on a bicycle with the training wheels, you know, the stabilizers, and then taking them off and having that first moment of like, oh my God. But then, you know, you start to like stabilize and you're like, oh, I can do this. That is exactly what it felt like this morning. And so even by like the second or third page, you know, I really started to catch my stride. And I there were certain places where I was reading like very fluidly. Now, not always, like I definitely stumbled here and there. There are some new words in here for me. And again, a lot of it is like, for example, when there's a sentence, or even a part of a sentence on the very first paragraph where they say 同事们都走了，只有安默 blah 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 blah， 还在公司。So the idea here is that like the colleagues, the other coworkers have all left already, and it's only Anmo and a few other people left in the office. But this very simple sentence, 同事们都走了, I read it as like they're all walking, because it's all could be like walking or going. And at first I hadn't quite pieced it together, but then I was like, wait, but they're still in the office. And then it clicked, like, oh, I see. This is like a way of saying everybody else, right? All the other colleagues have gone, they've already left. But Anmo and her other couple people, they're all still in the office. So again, there's something very magical about just reading a story in a narrative where you actually have to be able to piece together a story. You actually have to see how multiple sentences connect to each other, and it forces you to sort of start understanding those connective pieces. And so even though the language is very simple, once it is placed inside of a narrative and a story, and again, once you're forced to actually have to understand how each sentence flows into the next one, you can certainly find like, oh, this is actually not so simple. But the great thing is you have that knowledge in your head. And so I just think this is exactly what graded readers are for. And so again, there is an argument to be made that perhaps graded readers overall could be too slow. Steve Kaufman makes this argument fairly often, or at least he used to, where he believed that in this case, the first level has 300 Chinese characters that are used to tell the story. Level 2 has 450. So, he would argue in the past that it's just too slow. By the, going from 500 to 600 to 800 to 1, by the time you get to a level of sort of vocabulary, and in this case, a volume of characters which mimics the real world and real native authentic materials, it's going to take you forever. And so Steve used to always argue that it was much better to just jump in at the deep end. And there is an argument there. Like, I can see that, and I've done that myself. But I think, again, a lot of what I strive to achieve and to get out of this first phase of reading graded readers, it's taking the training wheels off. It's forcing myself to actually mobilize with the language that I have in my head. And yeah, building the confidence. And also, it's so much fun. I think that anybody in the audience who has tried to read a novel, a full-on novel in a foreign language, knows that it is astoundingly difficult. I mean, people often think that nonfiction will be more difficult because they might use more scientific words or complicated words, but novels are so much more difficult. The breadth of language that is used in a novel, because not only do you have narrative and you have these, all these descriptions, and again, there's so much of there's a tight link between every sentence, but also you may have characters in dialogues where some characters are perhaps from a stereotypical lower end of society, and maybe they have a very sort of casual way of speaking, packed full of slang and cultural references, historical references, and then other characters may be from a different, sort of level of society and have a different way of speaking, maybe formal, informal context. Just again, the breadth of language used in a novel is so astoundingly large that it's really a long journey to get to where that is a comfortable task. And so the idea that I can experience the same thing, but at a much lower level, and experience what it feels like to, I used this phrase in the last video that some of you enjoyed, like dance across a page and enjoy a real story, and take it in a new language for the first time. I just think it's so valuable, and already I'm ecstatic, right? I can't wait to read the next chapter. I can't wait to just to take in all the words, and again, every new word I learn, it's anchored in there so deeply, and I have such a deep curiosity to want to reread the first chapter and see if I can read it all the way through. I just think it's wonderful. And so what I've been doing is I've been just writing very, very simple notes. All I'm basically doing for now is I'm essentially just writing down the words that trip me up, any words that I didn't recognize the first time, any words I had trouble with, and then also little things like, oh, this is interesting. So I wrote down a phrase that you'll see here, and it was an interesting way of phrasing, like, someone has a good sense of dress, someone has a good sense of style, they know how to dress themselves. So right now, that's what I'm starting with, just taking notes, right? I enjoy taking notes. I like writing by hand, and so that's why I'm doing this. And then later, I'll probably put these words into a system like Scritter, or Anki, whatever you like. I'll talk more about that, I think, in the next episode of this series. But yeah, so I'll find a way to sort of make sure I consolidate this knowledge. But I think for now, I'm just really enjoying just diving in to my first story in Mandarin Chinese. I love it. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. I highly encourage all of you to dive into reading in the foreign language that you're learning, of course, if you do enjoy that activity. And thank you all for sharing your experiences in the last episode. And please do let me know if you've had a similar experience or maybe a different one to mine, diving into your first stories in your foreign language. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful Wednesday, and I'll see you back here on Friday for a different video.